Hello everyone, today I'm going to be looking at H.P. Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, one of his most important stories, if not the most important story, not least in the fact that it bifurcates his writing career from 1917 to 1926 and then 1926 to 1935. It is the culmination of all of his works from 1917 up until the point of writing The Call of Cthulhu, and it is the progenitor for all of his stories after writing this most seminal work. And I thought it quite pertinent today to discuss the factors that led up to the writing of The Call of Cthulhu. This is less of a timeline, even though it is going to be chronological. It is more so the turning points in Lovecraft's life and writing career that steered him, at least I believe, or influenced him in this direction. This is going to be less about the story itself. That'll be for another video. The kinds of themes that are in there, the stories that influence it, the topography, so on and so forth. Everything about the story, that's going to be for another video. Today it's just going to be the factors that led to The Call of Cthulhu. And I think with that in mind, the best place to start is with the resumption of his fiction writing in 1917. So in 1917 he wrote in June of that year The Tomb, and then he quickly followed that in July or August, depending on which letter you read from Lovecraft and which letter you believe from Lovecraft, Dagon. Before this he went on a 9-year hiatus, and his final story before that hiatus was The Alchemist in 1908. And the reason for this long hiatus was because Lovecraft believed he didn't, or rather his fiction wasn't very good, and so in essence he packed it in, did away with it, did away with a good majority of his juvenilia from that period of time, which dates from 1896/7 to 1908. We do have a few of his stories from that period, so for example the Alchemist, as I just mentioned, and his 1905 The Beast in the Cave. Some stories that were lost were, or rather destroyed, because he did destroy them, was The Picture in the House from 1907, which he redid as The Picture in the House in 1920, and this Moon Thriller, which also is for another video because that's quite interesting. This hiatus obviously went on for 9 years. In that interim period, there's very little on Lovecraft's life. We know that he was interested in amateur journalism, chemistry, but an important point in this 9-year period is 1916, where he publishes to The Vagrant his 1908 The Alchemist, and one of his colleagues or friends or correspondents, his name's W.P. Cook, and he reads The Alchemist in The Vagrant and he says to Lovecraft, "You've got a knack for this, you should write some more stories." And Lovecraft must have denied about this, and he knuckled down in June 1917 and wrote The Tomb, and then Dagon a month or two later. What's interesting in this time period is this resumption may never have happened, at least probably not at this time, if not at all, because a month prior to this, and I've got his selected letters here, on the 23rd of May 1917 he writes to Reinhard Kleiner, "Some time ago, impressed by my entire uselessness in the world, I resolved to attempt enlistment despite my almost invalid condition." So he almost enlists in the Rhode Island National Guard ring. He's turned away, and his mother finds out, and she does a bit of finger wagging, like, "How dare you, Howard, go behind me without telling me. You're never to enlist there again." And he doesn't. He actually, it hits him quite hard. And he discusses it again just a week later to Maurice Mo. "My dear Mo," and this is on the 30th of May, "realising the utter inconsequentiality of one man, more or less, in this insignificant world, I lately endeavoured to justify my hitherto useless existence by ending it in the army. Specifically, I attempted, despite my frail and nervous physique, to enlist in the RI National Guard, trusting to the sheer force of my psychological stimulus to keep me alive and on my feet until a Hunnish missile might gracefully dispose of me." And then again, I'm just going to fast forward a bit, 22nd of June, again, similar sort of thing, again to Reinhard Kleiner, and then Reinhard Kleiner again. He says here that the guard examination, and this is on the 27th of August, "The guard examination was somewhat less clumsy than that which you underwent. It was conducted in an office whose privacy was absolute, and whose floor and temperature was both subtle," yada yada yada, right? So he tries and isn't successful, and his mother finds out. Mother not happy, and then that's that. That's the end of that chapter. But I think it's important to note that this was a fork in the road for Lovecraft. So him joining the army didn't work, and had he joined, he may never have written The Tomb. He may never have written Dagon. He may have returned, and he may have written similar stories or different stories completely. But this fork in the road is quite significant. Now he writes obviously The Tomb, Dagon, and then he writes Polaris. And this again ties back in with his attempt to enlist in the army. Folks have said that Polaris, that he wrote in May 1918, roughly thereabouts, is semi-autobiographical in the sense that the narrator in the story wants to help out but can't, and all he can do is just watch. What's remarkable about this story, aside from the fact that it was Lovecraft's attempt to try and express his emotion with his fail to enlist, is that it is in the style of somebody who would become known about a year and a half later in September 1920. Folks later on have noted that, and I'm discussing here his friends and colleagues and people who read his stories. People believe that Polaris was inspired by Lord Dunsany, one of Lovecraft's literary heroes and one of the only ones that he ever met. And he met him on the 20th of October 1919, he sat front row and he listened to Lord Dunsany for however long at this lecture. Now, this turning point for Lovecraft is incredibly substantial insofar as in a letter, I believe in 1927, Lovecraft notes that this period from 1919 to 1921 is his ultra-Dunsanian period. He calls it his ultra-Dunsanian period. There is a plethora of writing. This explosion of stories that are inspired by Lord Dunsany. And it carries on for a 2-year period. This is less about the fact that he wrote all this and more about the fact that Lord Dunsany inspired the pantheon that we all know about, the Cthulhu pantheon. So Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth and stuff like that. And I have here his 1933 autobiography. This is Lovecraft's 1933 autobiography. And here he says, quote, "About 1919, the discovery of Lord Dunsany, from whom I got the idea of the artificial pantheon and myth background represented by Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Yuggoth, etc., gave a vast impetus to my weird writing." So not only did Lord Dunsany inspire Lovecraft to write all these amazing stories that he did in this 2-year period, but he also inspired him to write this pantheon, again encapsulated by Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth. The next turning point, or rather the next influential thing for Lovecraft in gearing him up to writing the Call of Cthulhu, is the emergence of a Commonplace book that he started keeping around late December 1919 or early January 1920. Now, we don't know exactly when he started writing this Commonplace book. We can speculate that he began this in early January 1920, but we can't really know for certain. And this Commonplace book is a book containing all of his ideas from dreams, from books that he's read, from experiences he has, so on and so forth. So if I just turn again to his letters, and this one is to Reinhard Kleiner on the 23rd of January 1920. And, the first paragraph is discussing something else. But then he says, "I have lately, by the way, been collecting ideas and images for subsequent use in fiction. For the first time in my life, I am keeping a Commonplace book, if that term can be applied to a repository of gruesome and fantastic thoughts." And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Because a couple of weeks later, he says again to Reinhard Kleiner on the 10th of February 1920, "That Commonplace book of mine, as you surmise, rather out of the ordinary. I will quote a few of the items. A very ancient colossus in a very ancient desert, face gone. No man hath seen it." And here's another one. "Man climbs mountain towards some horrible goal, cloud passes over, man seen no more." So you get the idea, you get the gist of what this Commonplace book contains. And if I just show you, so this is the beginning of the Commonplace book. This is a typed version. There is a handwritten version, but for clarity, I'm just going to show you the typed version. And as you can see, part way down, here, A very ancient colossus in a very ancient desert, face gone, no man has seen it. So this is the entry that Lovecraft told Ronald Kleiner. And you can see here, just a couple of entries up, revised 1907 tale, painting of ultimate horror. So this is the one that he destroyed in from 1907, one of his Juvenilia pieces. Of note, here, partway down, we see Azathoth, which Lovecraft notes as a hideous name. And partway up here, the Cats of Ulthar, so a story that he wrote later on in the middle of the year, June 15th. One of his favourite stories. Again, the plot germ for all that is here. And we can guess, or rather speculate, that this was written in May 1920, this plot germ, because there's a letter that he writes to Ronald Kleiner, and he mentions the Cats of Ulthar, the title of it, and he says that this is going to be a story. And just under a month later, it just become a story. So, if I just bring you back here quickly, there is one here in Lord Dunsany's Idle Days of the Yan. Lovecraft, as Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi speculates, wrote this entry around early January 1920. So between this entry here and the Cats of Ulthar entry here, all of them in between are rather date from January up until May. I think it's May 21st for this entry here. What's important here, and what the turning point for this here is, the third line from the bottom, which reads, "Man visits Museum of Antiquities, asks that it accepts bas-relief he has just made. Old and learned curator, laughs and says he cannot accept anything so modern. Man says, yada yada yada." Just as a side note, by the way, this 1919 here, penciled in, or rather penned in, ignore that. This was typed up, I believe, in 1934, and Lovecraft's memory must have misremembered that actually these here are dated 1920, so ignore this. This is a after the fact edition. So, again, what's important about this is the plot germ for the Call of Cthulhu, and I've just put here the rest of it so that it carries on down to the fifth line here. Add good development and describe nature of bas-relief. That's just Lovecraft's additional comments on that matter. But again, important to note that this is the plot germ for the Call of Cthulhu. The next turning point for Lovecraft here, I mean, there is a lot going on in the interim period between 1920 and 1925, which is what I'm going to go to. There's a lot of important stuff that goes on. But the reason why I jump into 1925 is because of his diary entry, which is where he eventually sits down and plots out the Call of Cthulhu. If I just quickly go over here. So this is his 1925 diary, the only diary that we do have. I believe there were two more diaries, maybe there were more, but maybe there's a 1924 diary and a 1926 diary, based on the letters that he sent his Aunt Lillian. But his only surviving diary is the 1925 diary. And as you can see, partway down here, on the 30th of August 1925, write out story plot, the Call of Cthulhu. So this is the day when Lovecraft, something sparks in his mind, and he calls it the Call of Cthulhu, and he plots it out. Regrettably, we don't have these plot notes, unlike some of his other stories, like at the Mountains of Madness. We don't have these plot notes, so we don't know if this story was a little bit different come the end result. The reason why this particular point in Lovecraft's writing career is important is because in a letter to Lillian on the same day, so we can speculate that he wrote this letter in the evening. I'm going to read this here. A new story plot, and I'm reading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down, about midway. A new story plot, perhaps a short novel, had occurred to my awakening faculties, and it was imperative to get it down in skeletonic detail whilst it was fresh. This, of course, was a matter of hours, since I adopted my complete development scheme in full. The writing itself will now be a relatively simple matter. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. it's to be called The Call of Cthulhu, and I'll send you a copy as soon as it is written and typed. Though, of course, The Horror at Red Hook and He, which he wrote earlier on in the month, will come first. This new thing, if it turns out as long as I expect from a mere survey of the ground, ought to bring in a very decent sized check. It'll be in 3 or 4 parts. Yeah, that's really important, and it speaks to this time in Lovecraft's life. It was around this time, and obviously in much earlier than this as well, where Lovecraft was struggling financially. So much so that he and his then wife, Sonia Lovecraft, were selling furniture to stay afloat. And quite funnily enough, it would be mostly Sonia Lovecraft's furniture, as opposed to Lovecraft's, even though he did sell some of his own stuff rather begrudgingly. And so the impetus behind writing The Call of Cthulhu may have been for financial gain, which is something to keep in mind. So this is obviously another factor in the writing of The Call of Cthulhu. Now, the reason why I mention the writing itself will now be a relatively simple matter is because it would take him an entire year. I mean, I say an entire year because we don't know when he actually wrote the story, but it took him roughly a year to get this story down. And I'm just going to take a moment to try and roughly gauge when he may have written this. So this diary mentions nowhere of trying to attempt to write this. So up until the 31st December 1925, and a few days into 1926, there's no mention of it. And there's a letter that he sends to Clark Ashton Smith in December of 1925, saying that he's got this idea for a sunken island story, which is Cthulhu, and that he'll be the one to receive a copy of it once it's written, which is an important note to make. 1926, around mid to late February, we can't really ascertain when, he writes Cool Air, and then fast forward a little bit more to July, I think the 15th, he says that he hasn't written anything recently. Technically he did, which was Cool Air, but recently, probably to Lovecraft, is the last month or so. And then the next letter to Clark Ashton Smith is on the 12th of August 1926, where there's no mention of Cthulhu. However, the next important letter to mention here is to a person that he's collaborating with at the time, Wilfred Tellman. Tellman at that time was writing a story called Black Bottles, and Lovecraft was helping him with it. But on the 8th of September 1926, he writes to Tellman to say that he has written a hellish story set in Boston. And this story that he's referring to is Pickman's Model. And he tantalisingly, it's really unfortunate, but tantalisingly, he says that he wrote it the other day. Now, I don't know what Lovecraft's time of reference is for the other day. Mine is the other day. I mean, it could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 or 4 days. Unfortunately, we just don't know when he wrote Pickman's Model either. It could be like August, early September, it could be September 2nd, September 3rd, we don't know. But the reason why this is important is because in 1931, December 3rd, or roughly around that time, just after he finished writing The Shadow of Innsmouth, he sends to one of his friends and correspondents a list of tales that he'd written. If I just take a moment to show you this. So again, at the very beginning it says The Tomb was written in 1917, and then Dagon, 1917. Not all of his tales are here, but the key one that I want to discuss here quickly, or the key two that I want to discuss here quickly, is on the other page. So just scrolling down. The Picture in the House, 1920, which is the rewriting of a story 13 years ago, The Picture, in 1907. The Shunned House, 1924. The Horror at Red Hook, He, In the Vault, Cool Air. In the Vault was written in September 1925. Cool Air, mid-February, late February of 1926. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926. Pickman's Model. Now, the reason why this part's important is because this is, as far as we can hope, is accurate. Is a chronological order of when Lovecraft wrote these tales. And the reason why I'm saying hopefully is, if you cast your mind back to the Commonplace book that I mentioned earlier, that 1919 year that was circled is wrong, and we can only hope that the chronological order of these tales that he's written these in is accurate. So again, we have reason to believe that he is correct here with these two tales anyway. But this tells us that at some point between August 12th and September 8th, 1926, he wrote the Call of Cthulhu. And we can also further speculate that because the Call of Cthulhu is just under 12,000 words, he wrote it over a 3 to 4 day period, assuming that he wrote it non-stop on successive days. And the reason why I say this is because there are two more stories of similar length that he wrote over a 3 to 4 day period, and those are the Shunt House in 1924 and his 1933 The Thing on the Doorstep, which are both just under 11,000 words. So we can say with some certainty that he wrote it in the middle to late August, maybe even early September, although that is unlikely given that he wrote Pitman's Model the other day. I'm going to go on a limb and just say that it was mid to late August. It's possible that it stretched over into the 1st September, we don't know. But again, that's just my speculation. What happened after this? Well, he pitched it to Weird Tales, and Farnsworth Wright rejected it. And I do have his letter here about that, actually. This is to Frank Belknap Long on the 26th of October 1926. He's talking to him about a variety of things, but partway down he says, Little Farney rejected Grandpa's Cthulhu story on the ground that it was too slow and obscure for his zipping morons. So he didn't take it very well. This hope that he was going to get a decent sized cheque didn't come to fruition, which really must have really upset Lovecraft. Clearly upset him, calling him Little Farney. But Lovecraft eventually got this published. In July 1927, Donald Wandry, somebody who he would come to into correspondence with a little later on, wrote a letter to Farnsworth Wright, or at least spoke to him, saying that Lovecraft was going to pitch this Call of Cthulhu story elsewhere. And Farnsworth Wright said, okay, Lovecraft, give me that tale back and I'll publish it in Weird Tales, which he did in February of 1928. And then the rest is history. So those are the four main factors and potential dating of the Call of Cthulhu and the aftermath of writing it and then getting it published. So we have his resumption to writing in 1917. We have the influence of Lord Dunsany and the Pantheon idea, which is where Cthulhu came in. The Commonplace book, where the plot germ for the Call of Cthulhu lies, and fast forward 5 years, 1925, the financial situations in which may or may not have spurred him more so into writing the Call of Cthulhu. He writes it roughly a year later, in the summer of 1926, around August 12th, between August 12th and September 8th. Tries to publish it in October 1926. Farnsworth Wright is like now. Lovecraft is like Little Farney. And then 15 months later, it is published in Weird Tales in 1928. So, insofar as that's the case, that is the Call of Cthulhu. Those are the key points for the story. If you found that interesting, please give this video a like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you in the next video.